Welcome back. It's episode 29. Wow, 29 episodes into the New Levels Coaching Podcast. Remember, we are the endurance coaching podcast that brings the endurance world lots of inspiration, education, so you can literally go away and run with it. This week's episode is all about physiology, and I have finally got the one and only David Sheldon joining me. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. Finally managed to pin me down. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, not only pinned you down, managed to get you across to Loughborough, which is also great because we were talking about doing this virtually. But thankfully, Dave has come across the office today. And lots of people have been asking to bring Dave on because we've mentioned him a lot in our podcast. If you've been listening to the podcast previously, you'll hear us talking about physiology a lot. And quite often we refer to Dave because Dave is a brilliant physiologist who works over there in Birmingham. And I'll give a bit of an introduction to Dave and kind of the topic area before I actually ask Dave to introduce himself. So Dave is somebody who I've worked with for a number of years. I used to coach many moons ago when he was at Loughborough University, and he's a Loughborough University graduate. And as soon as Dave graduated here at Loughborough, I wanted to get him involved with NLC, and he was actually, apart from myself and Gemma, he was our first freelance coach to work with New Levels Coaching, and he's still here to the day. So that says some good things about us as a company, I hope. But I worked with Dave, and I could just see his knowledge and his passion for the sport. And what I liked about it was that he really applied his physiology well to the coaching world, and hence that marrying together quite well. And today I wanted to bring him on to talk a lot about physiology. And really the key message here is to simplify physiology. Dave and I were kind of joking a little bit tongue in cheek before we came on about how a lot of physiology is designed to try and simplify things for people, but actually it becomes a bit of a complicated mess in the end when people go into too much detail and overcomplicate things. So today is very much about simplifying things such as training zones, looking at training intensity and what that training intensity distribution looks like. Look at how we can make that practical as well within your own training. But also maybe get you away from the norms of thinking. And what I mean by that is looking at things like miles and kilometers and your paces and becoming obsessed with those numbers, and maybe shifting that dial a little bit and looking at it more from a time perspective and how that blends itself into physiology as well. So as a bit of an intro from me, I'm going to start by asking Dave our new question before we go into your intro, Dave. I always put people on the spot now, and I'm going to continue to do this as we go forward. We're going to kick off with a coaching positive from you, please.
Coaching positive. I'm going to go with the fact that I'm here in Loughborough. It's a rare occasion that I managed to get across to the coaching office that we have here at Loughborough. So it's been great to work in that shared space with all the coaches today. And we've been planning, spent the morning catching up on training programs, and we've been planning all things Morzine, haven't we? So yeah, that's a positive.
Well, you kind of nicked mine because I walked into the office this morning buzzing because you're here, Jethro's here, Rishi's in, Matt's in, Gemma's in, Kirsty's in, and it was just like a buzzing coaching office today, which is great because sometimes on a Wednesday I'm in on my own, so I've gone in on a Wednesday on my own, then I've come in today and it's like absolutely bouncing. Put the radio on and got us all upbeat. So yeah, I'm going to do that as a joint positive. But yes, we are off to Morzine in a couple of weeks' time, and it was great to plan for that too. Now, I'm assuming here that everybody knows who you are, Dave, because we mention you a lot, but not everybody does know who you are. So could you just give the listeners a little bit of an insight into you, your background, and what you're doing now as well with your career?
Sure. So obviously I'm a coach, hence why I'm here at the New Levels Coaching Office. But my main job, my day job, if you like, is an exercise physiologist, and I'm based over at the University of Birmingham. My role is actually fairly recently changed over there to a hybrid role. So part of my time is spent in the applied world, so working with athletes and coaches, trying to use physiology to inform their training, all about performance. And then the other half of my role is on the academic side. So I teach on our various sports science programs over there. And I also, if that wasn't enough, I've recently started a professional doctorate, which is essentially a PhD, an applied PhD, where I'm looking at altitude training and how we can use that, to better endurance performance in athletes.
Nice. Does that mean you're going to become Dr. Dave?
If all goes well, in a 3 or 4 years, I should have the Dr. Dave title. My mates have already started winding me up and calling me that. So Yeah, that's the plan.
Nice, Dr. Dave. I can't wait. We've got Dr. Matt Long, who's
Yeah.
a regular on the podcast.
Yeah.
Maybe we can make Dr. Dave a regular. So that gives us a bit of an insight into you and where you are with your career, Dave. And I know there's been some amazing, and there still is some amazing work going on over at Birmingham, and particularly around that physiology aspect and applying it to the athletes training there as well. You are a big part of NLC. You're a big part of our community, and people will know you from being an online coach and coaching at our workshops and retreats and camps. But also you were an athlete yourself, and I think it's worth touching on that too.
Yeah, it seems like a distant memory these days. I still run. I'm still very active. In fact, I've recently entered a triathlon. So yeah, still try and keep fit and enjoy the process of training and all things running. But yeah, back in the day, I was, as you said earlier, you were my last coach. That's not to say that you put me off the sport,
ran you into the ground.
No. So yeah, background in running, and particularly middle distance. So 1,500 meters was probably my best event. Yeah.
And one of my proudest coaching moments still to this day was when you made that British University's final indoors, and that was a big target of yours, and that was in my very early coaching career, so it was really nice to go through that process together. But yeah, Dave sometimes undersells himself a little bit on the athletic side and the athlete side, and it's great that he's still competing now, because I think him and I probably share similar values in the sense of we always want to compete, we always want to keep fit and healthy, and that's a big part of our day-to-day lives. But in some ways, I've ventured more towards the trails, and I know you're venturing more towards triathlon, where you're still involved, but you don't have necessarily that competitive edge in the same domain as where we've sat for so many years, which is quite nice, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And it's different, isn't it? I think, if I'm being honest, I don't think I could make progress now on my PBs and on the track. So I think, yeah, like you say, to tick that kind of competitive edge and still keep training and keep active, I've just shifted my focus to something else. And I guess I still involve very much so in the running space through my coaching and through working with the athletes at Birmingham.
And you work with, at Birmingham, you work with some of the highest level athletes in the country. It's fair to say, international athletes who are regularly competing right at the top end.
For sure. And we have a saying in our small performance team. So it's not just myself as a physiologist. We've got a team of S&C coaches, nutritionists, performance lifestyle, psychology, physio, you name it. We're our own best kept secret in that we work very in a bespoke way with our athletes. There's a big athletics program at Birmingham, so that's probably our main sport and where we've got the biggest depth in terms of athletics. We just won the British University's cross country championships with 1, 2, 3 in the men's, which was, I think it's been a while if ever been done before. But yeah, there's athletes across other sports as well. We work with swimmers, triathletes, if they're of a kind of international standard or kind of on the trajectory towards that. We support athletes across a range of sports.
Yeah, I'm a massive fan of the work that you all do over there. It's quite incredible to see, and I think it is. I think it was a secret. I think word is spreading fast. Results speak for themselves, and once results start coming, people start paying attention, which is great, and it's testament to the work that goes in over at Birmingham. So kudos to the team over there. The other thing I would say is what I love about the line of work that you're in and the way you do operate is that you're operating at that elite level, but then you help runners and even triathletes of all abilities, from people who have decided to take up triathlon for the first time, like yourself. I know you've worked with some of them at NLC, from people who are experienced marathon runners, people who are maybe trying to break 5K PBs. So you're always dipping your toe in at all levels. And I believe it's important as a coach to do that, because I think if you do that, you get to really experience the sport as a whole. And I know, I certainly believe when we talk about physiology, it helps to develop your coaching knowledge, especially in a physiological way.
Yeah, definitely. And I get as much satisfaction and joy from seeing somebody complete their first marathon or first triathlon as I do somebody making a major games team out of the Birmingham setup. There's a lot of crossover and parallels, and the everyday athlete can learn a lot from the elite athlete, and probably vice versa. But there's also some quite subtle and not so subtle differences. So we can't just take an elite athlete's training program and apply it to somebody that's just started out. There's that's probably a recipe for disaster.
Well, that's a really good place to start, I think, because like you say, there are some similarities. There's some things that are just the same, physiology speaking. We are all trying to train or certainly a similar physiology, depending on what event groups are in, and then there are massive differences as well within that too. But I think you touched on something really nicely there about, we can learn from the elites. Anybody can learn from an elite athlete, but actually elites can learn from your everyday athletes. Some of the everyday athletes we work with, as we know, are a lot more professional and they take it a lot more serious.
Yeah, definitely. You almost have to be. Most athletes are working full time. They might have kids, and therefore they have to be quite professional and certainly efficient with their time, and really think about, I've got a limited amount of time and resource, and how am I going to distribute that? What am I going to do with it? And I think one of the biggest things that the elites can learn, or some elites could learn from, the kind of everyday athlete, is that it just enjoy the sport and don't be, too. Yeah, like as a physiologist, you'd probably expect me to be saying, we want to be really dialed in and specific and with everything we do, but actually just enjoying the sport. And taking the pressure off in that sense can be just as valuable. So I think, elites, there's a lot of pressure to perform, and actually just we probably see, think about the athletes I coach. Often the best results come from when the athlete's happy and they're just enjoying the training. I'd sacrifice some specificity in terms of the training plan and the intensities they're running at for just keeping them happy and consistent and enjoying the sport. Me and Jeffro had a conversation earlier about athletes who like to jump in with group sessions, and how actually I'm all for that. And whilst the session, club session on the track might not be exactly what I would have set the athlete, the benefit of getting down there and running with a group and enjoying it, for me, outweighs, the specificity of exactly what I would have maybe set on that day.
And for every research study that's been done in a lab, there's also a lot of literature to back up the psychological benefits of training in a group and being happy, and the social element of the sport leading to increased improvements in performance. Yeah. So I think it's good to hear a physiologist recognizing that. In the same way, people who work in psychology would also recognize that physiology does play a part. But it's a broader picture, isn't it? It's a holistic model. 100%. It's involving everything here to get results.
Yeah, 100%. And that's, I've kind of learned that with experience, really. And I think when I first started coaching, when you were saying earlier about me starting off, I had a few flashbacks there. And my coaching philosophy was very physiology, scientifically driven. And actually now, like, don't get me wrong, my philosophy and my training plans I like to think are underpinned by science and by key physiological principles, but I now recognise that coaching is as much of an art as it is a science, and yeah, I guess that's come through experience, really, and I'm still learning for sure.
It's a really nice way to put it, and I think we cover a lot of the art of coaching on our podcast. You can go back and listen to numerous podcast episodes, and you'll see the different coaches who come on board, and you'll see how everyone has differentials within their coaching style. It is an art; it's a skill, I believe. But under that, we are still applying that scientific knowledge and that scientific base to a lot of the coaching we do, which is, I think, what you do so well, and you help a lot of our coaches with as well. And I've seen you've certainly helped me. I would almost say I was maybe on the opposite end of that spectrum when I first went into coaching. I understood the science. I was never brilliant at it, but I understood it. And over time, I've become better at it through learning and developing. But I was very much, how do I get the best out of my athletes mentally? How do I make sure they're enjoying the sport? How do I keep them fit and healthy? Because I know that's going to lead to increased performance. But at some point, you've got to be able to, turn that screw scientifically to get the adaptations you want from certain people. And now I understand that better. I definitely see better results as a result of that. So let's dive into it then. So the science behind it, because that's the purpose of this pod in particular. I want to kick off with the kind of training zones, the training intensities, because as a coach, I believe this is the area that a lot of people overcomplicate. I believe that social media plays a part in that. And there's too many people out there who claim to be gurus and are just trying to get clicks, and they are doing it for clickbait. And as a result, they tell people, well, one minute you see that people should have 8 different training zones, 9 different training zones. And then the next minute you see people telling them that they should only train in zone 2, which is the fad at the minute. And people buy into that too. I look at it and I just think, I'll be honest, that's just complete bullshit. And I want to call people out, and maybe I should do more. So today is about actually putting a bit of truth behind this science and saying, well, what are these things, and how can we actually simplify it so that everybody who's tuning in will go away with some level of understanding? So I want to kick off with the training zones, Dave, how you describe them.
Yeah, it's how long have we got? No, you're dead right, and it's almost ironic, isn't it, that if you think of the purpose of training zones, it's as a coach or an athlete to try and provide clarity and to provide a purpose to the sessions that you're doing. But actually, we've created the online community, the scientific community even, like we've created a bit of a mess in terms of there's probably more ambiguity now and more confusion because of all the different zones. You mentioned 8 zones there. Not only is there sometimes upwards of 8 zones, they're all called different things depending on which sport you're in and what, who you speak to. So it is a complicated one. And I guess like breaking it down to, science and where these zones come from or should come from. Like physiologically speaking, there really is only what we call a 3-zone model. And that being that everything below what we call the first lactate threshold, which we can explain it in a minute. But everything below the first lactate threshold, which is an intensity that you can probably sustain for 3 or 4 hours as long as you're appropriately fueled. That's kind of physiologically called the moderate zone. I'd rather call it just easy.
Yeah.
So that's where your easy training should be. If it wasn't complicated enough to have one lactate threshold, we also have a second lactate threshold, which is physiologically speaking, it's the maximum lactate steady state. So it's the maximum speed or intensity that we can run at or we can cycle at whilst we keep our physiology in a steady state, so it doesn't keep rising. And if we were to measure lactate concentrations or heart rate or oxygen consumption, it would remain stable. Okay, it wouldn't get out of control, causing us to fatigue. So between the 2 lactate thresholds is that second main zone, what I'd call moderate or medium intensity, and then everything above the second lactate threshold. And that second threshold is something that you can sustain for around about an hour, give or take, depending on your level of conditioning. Everything above that is hard in physiologically speaking. Now those zones are obviously quite wide, but physiologically those 2 thresholds are the only real boundaries. They're the only clear breakpoints in physiology, i.e. there's a distinct thing that is happening physiologically that you transition from one intensity domain to another.
Yeah.
Now you can then expand on that, and that's kind of what people have done and created more zones, because zone 1 on a 3-zone model can be anything from rest through to, if you're a very fit athlete, could be if you're talking Elliot Kipchoge, it could be up to 5 minutes per mile. 5 minutes per mile. So there's a huge zone there. So often we break that first zone into 2 zones, and we call it often recovery and easy. And that really, there has to be an arbitrary split there. There's nothing physiologically. It's a scale. The faster you start running throughout that zone, the higher your heart rate will be. But if you were to measure a lactate concentration in that zone 1 below the first lactate threshold, you'd have what we call a baseline level of lactate in the blood. There'd be little to no lactate, i.e. you're working pretty much exclusively using your aerobic system.
And that's the key there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. It's aerobic. You're not. When we're running, when we're cycling, we need to supply energy to operate at that intensity, and we can do that through our aerobic energy system and our anaerobic energy system. Or when we start seeing lactate, that's because we're burning carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen. so anaerobically essentially, and we start to see lactate being produced, and that's when we start moving up those intensities. But yeah, I guess coming back to the zones, that that zone 1 can be split into 2. So you'd often have a recovery and an easy. And then the second, so between the 2 thresholds, that also can be quite wide zone. So, it can be anything from marathon pace to 10K pace. And, if we got people to run at 10K pace or marathon pace, it can feel very differently. So again, I think that's where it's okay to deviate a little bit away from physiology and think, okay, well, these are based on key physiological principles, but actually we need a more usable training zone. So we split that middle zone into, in a running sense, and certainly at Birmingham, we use the term steady and tempo.
Yeah.
Tempo is means different things depending on which sport and which coach you talk to, but it can also be called threshold is another key term. And then everything above in that final zone, again, that can be anything from 10K half marathon pace through to maximum sprint speed. It's really difficult to prescribe zones in that. So I prefer to just call that one big zone of interval training.
Yeah.
And depending on the goal, whether you're trying to work on your aerobic capacity or your anaerobic capacity, depends on the intensity that you're trying to target there.
I think that's a really good place to stop and pick apart that interval, and we'll kind of backtrack, I guess, with this, but the interval part of it, for me, as you say, it depends on how well trained people are, depends on what pace or intensity they're going to go at within that, above that lactate 2 point, that threshold 2. And that is where it's so important to get the prescription of your sessions right as a coach, and for you to understand the athlete you're working with, because you could be setting the same session and that session could have slight differentials based on the athlete that you're working with. And what I mean by that is, if I've got an athlete who, let's say, for argument's sake, is one of the best in the world and can run a half marathon at 60 minutes. And I'm going to set them a session where I want them to work in and around that lactate threshold 2 or just above. Well, that session that I set them is going to be far different for somebody who I know runs a half marathon in even 90 minutes, or someone who runs a half marathon in 2 hours.
Yeah.
Now, they're training for the same distance, but the time at which they're out for that same distance is very, very different.
Yeah.
And this is where it starts to become, like you say, complicated. And this is what annoys me on social media about the coaching world in particular. I'm going to hang the coaches out to dry here, is you see coaches, I've seen it yesterday, I was on social media, and they said, threshold pace is between half marathon and 10K pace. And I was like, well, it's not really, is it? Because it depends on who the individual is.
We'll probably say that a lot. It depends, but it really does. And yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a really, really key point, because physiology works on time. It doesn't know how far you're running, or
exactly that,
how much power you're putting out on a bike. Like I say, really, you should be. And I've been guilty of it when I was describing the zones. Then I talked about half marathon pace or 10K pace.
But you're doing it to give people like an understanding.
An understanding,
yeah.
but it's more, give or take. Again, that first threshold maybe 4 hours, second threshold maybe an hour. But like you say, if you're a world-class half marathon runner, your threshold is pretty much bang on your half marathon pace. So, setting a session where you do, I don't know, maybe mile reps or a continuous tempo run at half marathon pace is probably hitting that threshold. Whereas if you give somebody that's running 2 hours or even 2.5 hours for the half marathon, the same session, I don't know, 5 mile tempo at half marathon pace, it's the relative intensity and the training zone that you're in physiologically is distinctly different. It's a lot lower in that example. If we take the marathon as an example, someone running 2 hours for the marathon versus 6 hours, it's a completely different event.
Yeah.
For the 2 hour marathon runner, you're pretty much, if you were to measure Kipchoge's lactate and his sub 2 attempt, or not his attempt, he did it, didn't he? It would probably be close to that second lactate threshold. So he's really at the top end of that middle zone, if you like.
Certainly smack bang in the middle, isn't he? Right,
At
for
least,
a long time.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas a 6 hour runner, you can't run for 6 hours and be above your first lactate threshold. So it's a very different event, and I guess the training should reflect that. So yeah, I guess that that annoys me a little bit when you see generic training plans online for a marathon. And okay, some of them account for the predicted time that you're after, but the marathon is, or any event is, very different depending on how quickly you're covering it.
Well, we'll come on to time a little bit later on, because it's something I want to kind of ask you about, because as a coach, I'm now going more to time-based sessions, because I've just been learning, like, as I've been planning my sessions, I'll just be open and honest here, like, you're getting an insight into my coaching brain. I've done things the same way for years, and I'm now challenging myself to change, because I'm sat there looking at a session and I'm thinking, what does that physiologically do for my athlete? Like, what does it do? What do I want it to do? And then I'm going, well, rather than set K reps or 400 meter reps or mile reps, why don't I just set time? I want to get them to have 45 minutes worth of tempo work. So I'm just going to set them 45 minutes worth of tempo work, and I'm going to break it down into chunks of time that I want to break it down into. And actually it becomes quite simple. The problem with that, which we'll go on to in more detail later, is sometimes people like things to be fancy and they don't always like it to just be very simple, and time can often be quite simple. But if we go back to that scale, that intensity scale and those zones, Dave, I'm going to backtrack from that highest one we've just discussed to the middle one, because it is a big zone, as you speak about, and a lot can fit in there. But ultimately, Matt Long, who comes on, always gives analogies of things, and I like to give analogies to people as well. And my understanding of that middle system is, let's say we've got a bucket here in front of us, and that bucket has a tiny hole in one end, and we've got another jug of water. So we've got a bucket in one hand and we've got a jug of water in the other. That bucket has got a slight hole in it. As we start to tip the water into that bucket, if the water continues to drain at a steady state out of that hole, then that's a similar kind of analogy as being in that zone between threshold 1 and threshold 2, in the sense of we're able to clear at a similar rate to we're pouring in.
Yeah.
And that refers to lactate. It's the same principle.
Yeah, exactly that. And that's why we call it steady. Things are in a steady state. So they might be elevated. In fact, they will be elevated in that zone. If you were to measure blood lactate, it would be elevated above baseline, but it would remain stable in that zone, because, like you say, our body is able to clear at the same rate. So rate of production equals rate of clearance.
Yeah. So we've got this bucket here, and it's got a little bit of water in there because it's still draining it through, but it's draining it through quite steadily, and it's going out there. So similar to that, we could measure the lactate and we would see something in there, but actually it's clearing quite nicely. And as you rightly say, Dave, it's a nice steady state. However, if I then say, right, I'm just going to pour this in faster, and the intensity of that water goes up and it comes in, then that's where we almost get a clogging in this instance, and that bucket starts to rise. And then that's where we see that threshold start to increase. And I always think that, for me, as a visual, is like really important, because that's what's happening internally, isn't it? Once that intensity increases.
Yeah, exactly that. So you're using your anaerobic system at a rate that our aerobic system that clears the lactate can't keep up. So you end up with this net increase in water, using your analogy, in the tub. But if we're thinking physiologically, in blood lactate, in heart rate, in oxygen uptake, you just get this steady rise until we won't get into the causes of fatigue. Lactate doesn't cause fatigue as such, but it's certainly associated with the buildup of fatigue. So as lactate starts to rise in the blood, you will start feeling that, and you'll start to feel progressively tired and eventually have to stop.
So then we go from there. So we've got the middle system, almost, as you said, the moderate system, the second big system. And we go below that to, I would agree with you as well, surely it's easy. But I can see why people might not call it that, because some people class easy as like going for a walk, for example.
I mean, again, for me, it's physiologists like to overcomplicate things. And we call those three zones moderate, heavy, and severe. I mean, for me, it's easy, moderate, hard. but there we go.
To simplify, for the purpose of this podcast, we're going to go easy, moderate, hard.
Yes.
Easy, moderate, and hard. So once we get to easy, which, as you described again very nicely, is that below the LT1 turn point, the lactate threshold 1, that is where we see often easy or recovery activity at that, what I would class as like the baseline level. And why are we not then generating much lactate there? What's going on scientifically to say, well, we're not generating much lactate? It's not really getting above sort of 2 on the scale.
Yeah, there'll always be a little bit running around the system, which is why we call it a baseline level. But I guess to use your analogy, it'd be the empty tub, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
You're not pouring anything in, because we're at an intensity where, if we've got a well-developed aerobic system, then we're able to cover that using that aerobic system. And our aerobic system doesn't produce lactate, and any lactate that is produced is quickly dispelled. It's quickly got rid of before it even appears in the blood. So at a muscular level. So yeah, it's yeah, I guess that's probably the easiest
Brilliant.
scientific definition without going too deep into it.
Brilliant. So I'm going to go back to my analogy to finish this off. So we go back to our tub. We've got our bucket there, and we've got the hole on the side. And that hole on the side isn't right at the bottom, because you wouldn't have it right in the bottom. You'd have it slightly up on the side. And the reason there's some water in the tub is because we've poured some water in, but it's not quite hit the hole at the side of the level. So we've always got some in there, but
Very
until it
good.
rises up to that hole, it's not going to start moving out. So we've always got a baseline in there, and we can use that. Okay, perfect. Right. With that, I'm now going to go back up there for the intensity, or certainly like the paces, because, and I'm going to do this as an example. So we're going to extremes here. You've used Eliud Kipchoge. You know, we could use anybody from that female population as well. Someone like Sifan Hassan, who's super quick and running like 2:13 these days, which is just insane. Around 2 hours for the marathon. We've got them at one end of the spectrum, and then we've got somebody who's saying, right, I want to go to the marathon for the first time, and I want to use a run-walk strategy, and I'm happy to get it done in 6.5 hours. I know that's the cutoff, so I want to get it done around 6.5 hours. When we talk about that low, easy zone, that easy intensity, or the pace that they go at, is going to be so different. And this is why people who have maybe never done the run walk method should consider it at a certain level, because if we go back to that point of not generating too much lactate and putting ourselves in trouble, you can use the run walk method really effectively to keep yourself in that zone. Because a lot of people who don't inevitably end up in the next zone up, don't they, with the training? That's what we see a lot.
Yeah, definitely. It's certainly a strategy if to include some walking in your easy running if you're struggling to keep the intensity down. Because yeah, like I guess the way to look at it is if you're a relatively speaking slower athlete, you're just new to the sport, your range of paces of zones is so condensed. Like if you're running at 10k an hour is your 10k pace, like when does a walk become a run? I mean, that's a different question, but the pace, there's the difference between when you start jogging to your almost your maximum speed, or if you want to say 10k speed, is so relatively small. Whereas a Kipchoge or a 1500 meter runner, their range is so much bigger, so they can be running and clipping along quite quickly, but still remain in a below that lactate threshold and in their easy zone. So yeah, it's very difficult for some people to run easy enough. But the issue we find is if we think back to the 3-zone model for simplicity: easy, moderate, hard. Again, what we said at the start, we can learn from the elites. What we see is that most of their training is in that easy zone. It's below the first threshold. How the rest is distributed is an interesting debate in itself, an interesting question. The 80-20 is very popular online, which is an example of polarized training, which means 80% of your training in zone 1, in the easy, nothing really in the middle, and 20% hard. What we're seeing more and more often, particularly in the elite guys, and as we move up the distances, is a more pyramidal approach. And what I mean by that is most of the training is still easy, so that's a consistent theme. The next most populated zone is that middle zone, so the moderate zone, and then there's a little bit of intensity, high intensity in there as well. What we see with most runners, particularly new athletes or relatively slower athletes, is everything just piles into that middle zone, and that easy zone, which should form the bulk of the training, everything gets pushed into the middle zone. And so the easy runs are not really easy. They're actually quite, moderate. So it might feel comfortable, but physiologically speaking, it's not easy. And that means that the issue with that, you might think harder is better. And if I can run a bit faster on those runs, then great. But the cost associated with the easy zone the middle zone is far greater than if we're to stay in our easy zone. So what happens is we carry that fatigue, that residual fatigue, into our next day, our next session, and maybe that's a hard session, and we're tired because we've not stayed in our easy zone, and then the quality of the hard session gets compromised, and that's also in that middle zone. So we end up with a threshold model where everything's in the middle ground. It's kind of, yeah, hard but not too hard.
And that intensity distribution, which you talk a lot of, isn't there, and it still should be, and it's not. And that's what annoys me about some of these things online, where you see, oh, you should do all of this in one zone and all of this, and I'm like, don't spout off that rubbish. Basically, what you're saying is, if somebody's under trained and they go out and train and they just do that in one zone, they'll get fit. Yeah, of course they will. There's not much science behind that, other than that if you go out and exercise, you will get fit to a certain level. But if you want to improve performance long term, you have to think a little bit more about that.
I think that's the key word. It's long term. Like, you will, if you're starting off, and I don't actually think it's a bad thing just to go out and run and just, build up your frequency of running. And it doesn't really matter what zone you're in at that point, but you are limited if you continue with that approach and you don't start being a bit more strategic and vary your training intensity. You'll soon hit a plateau. I mean, the example I would give it is parkrun, and I'm a huge advocate of parkrun. But if you go and just do a parkrun every week, and that's all you do, and you go and try and run as quick as you can over the 5K, you probably improve your time for the first few times, and you think, oh, this is good. But I guarantee you'll very quickly stop improving that 5K time, and that's when we need to, take a bit more of a strategic approach and maybe start dropping the intensity on certain run, adding more in, dropping the intensity, and by keeping things easy. I think that's the key. Is it allows us to build up our training volume, which we know, without any real physiological rationale, but we know that if you can tolerate, again, it's a relative value. We're not expecting everybody to run 100 miles a week, but if we can gradually bump up your training volume, and you're making sure you're recovering properly and you're fueling appropriately for that, you will get fitter. And the way to do that is to keep the majority of it easy.
And I think that's why I wanted to do a podcast originally, was to give people the education to go away and say, oh, actually, I've listened to that episode and I now know how to do something slightly different. But also there is the element of, I did want to showcase our coaches as well and show the knowledge and expertise that we bring to the table, because there may be people sat there at home thinking, I have hit that plateau, and actually I want to get to that next level, and I do want to work with a coach. And that's why we've created a coaching company that is accessible to runners of all abilities, because the majority of the people we speak to get to that point that you've just described, where they've been able to get to a certain point by getting fitter. And then at that point, no fault of their own, is like, okay, I'm now a bit limited here as to where I go next. And it has to be more of a strategic approach. But there's also really good books out there and other podcasts. But what I would say is, just be careful with all the stuff that you're reading. Like, do it from good sources and things that you trust, and listen to the appropriate resources, because there is a lot of crap online now, and you can find so much out there that does go back to the thing of overcomplicating it. And before you know, you're in a mess, and you're becoming injured and that type of thing. So just be careful if you are going down that route. I want to throw another analogy at you here, Dave, because I think it is appropriate. Of, you mentioned about, and I'll use the word, more well-trained athletes, so athletes who've trained for years, who've got that experience and that base and that foundation. What I find with those athletes is it's like a bigger car engine, or a bigger car. It's got the ability, it's got more gears on that car. So they've got the 6 gears, even maybe the 7 gears if they're right at the top, compared to maybe a car with a smaller engine that's got less gears, or a bike in the same fashion. But they just don't have as many gears, and it's no fault of anybody's, other than that they haven't been through the same years of training, the same years of development of those systems. So they don't have as many gears to go through. And because of that, that's why I think we find a lot in gears 2 and 3. Say it's a 4-gear system. We find a lot in gears 2 and 3, and not so much in 1 and not so much in 4. And they almost, like, again, back to that car analogy, burn the gears out because they spend so much time in them and they're not using the right gears. And I find that as people get more experience and as they do more training, they almost have the ability to go through more gears. Is that like a good enough analogy for you as a scientist?
No, I think so. And the other thing I'd add to that is, it's kind of linked, but kind of not, is running in a group versus running on your own. I think I'd be the first to put my hand up. When I run on my own, I probably do have a tendency sometimes to
Definitely, I know what you're saying.
push the
Yeah.
easy runs a little bit. I've
Yeah.
got 7 miles on the planner. I just want to get it done. I feel good. Whereas if I'm running with a friend and chatting away, I don't even look at the pace. So there's that. And yeah, I think it's a bit like chicken and egg with the elite guys as to why they do so much of a proportion in their easy zone. Is it a product of because they do lots of volume, like it has to be easy, or is it because they do it easy, they're able to do more training? And I think it's a bit of both. But yeah, I think it just like ultimately athletes are not very good at being disciplined, and I guess part of that starts with the education and explaining why it's important, and just zooming out and taking a bigger picture of a simple way that I would, if I had that issue with an athlete that they're running too fast in their easy runs, is I'd just say, well, what's the purpose of training? I'd ask them that, and often they think, yeah, it's a good question. What is the purpose of training? And particularly when we talk about interval training and stuff like that, like people automatically associate, well, it's to run the best I can and to almost to get a PB in that session. But actually, the purpose of training is, and thinking from a physiologist perspective, is to provide an appropriate stimulus for a response or an adaptation. So if we're trying to work on our aerobic system and build our tolerance to running more miles, why run harder and stress the physiology, stress the body more than we need to? And I think that's where, yeah, just dialing it back 10%, you'd be amazed by how we use the word cost a lot. The cost is so much lower by just slowing down a bit. I think I've very rarely come across athletes who underdo intensity. It's usually the opposite. So yeah, why work harder for the same response? Would be my kind of analogy there.
So the word you used there was purpose, do things with purpose. And I really like that: purposeful practice, do everything in your plan with purpose. But this has been two of my biggest learnings as a coach over, well, certainly the last sort of 2 years. Firstly, don't assume that what you prescribe, everybody understands. So what you're prescribing, check that they understand what you want from that session or that run. And once they get that understanding, then that's often when they get the best responses, because they're starting to do that properly. But then the second one is, what am I as a coach looking to elicit physiologically from that session? What do I want to achieve? So rather than just putting a session in the plan, what am I looking to get from that, physiologically speaking? That isn't just go out and run hard or go out and run easy. Why am I putting it in the plan? Like if I'm looking to develop volume at a certain stage, then stick volume in the plan and don't be afraid to put volume in the plan. But if I'm going to put volume in the plan, make sure the intensity is the right level. And maybe if I'm putting more volume in the plan, something else needs to give somewhere. So understanding the purpose of why you're putting it in is one thing, but then making sure the person on the other end understands that purpose is also vitally important to success.
I think that's so important. It is almost like a shared vocabulary, and that's something. If I refer to Birmingham, we sat down as a coaching team. We sit down every month as a coaching team, and been fortunate enough to be invited into those conversations as a physiologist to almost bring a different perspective. But one of the things we reflected on last year was, yeah, exactly this conversation: training zones and the ambiguity, and at the very least, like, I don't mind if people have different zones or call things different things, as long as the coach, the athlete, and the physiologist, in my example there, are all on the same page. And if I say tempo, the athlete knows and the coach knows exactly what I mean. And we often, we use, you've probably seen the Norwegians, the Ingebrigtsens taking lactate samples, and that looks great. It looks super cool. But often we're using that to almost validate. We're not using it to dictate the intensity. We're using it to validate the training and to almost check. So if we monitor a tempo run to check they're in the right zone, I actually ask a lot of our athletes now to guess their lactate before the reading comes back.
And I bet they've got better at it.
Yeah, 100%. There's one athlete, Tamer, he won't mind me saying, he he's progressed massively over the last couple of years and been really diligent with training intensity, and he's had to be because he's increased his training volume, and now he's very dialed in and normally can predict it within 0.2, 0.3 of a millimole.
Amazing.
Which again, it's purely there to, I could take that away. He doesn't need that. He's not relying on that lactate value to execute his sessions, but it's just, yes, positive reinforcement. Sometimes it might be a bit elevated, and we'd say, pull it back. You're on a bad day. You're a bit fatigued for whatever reason, and that's great. But yeah, sorry, I think a bit of a tangent there, but
no, it's a really good tangent because it spins onto the next point very nice. It's almost like you planned it. But let's use that example, because people will be sat there going, well, that's great, but I don't have a lactate pro at the side of my training run, or I don't have a physiologist with me there. But I think you make some really good points, Dave, around if you do this enough and you start to understand it well enough and you have the right people around you, or you're certainly investing in yourself to get that knowledge, then you will gain that understanding. Like with anything, you get better at things that you practice and that you learn. In the same way as I'm very intuitive with the times that I can run on a track, a lap time. Like if you set me a lap time now, I reckon I could get within a couple of seconds of it if I had to. Depending on what you set me to, fair. If you started it, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. But it comes back to the same point as we learn that, we get to know ourselves better. But then there's always that period of time where maybe we are a bit under the weather and we do think that we're feeling fine. But there are some things that we can look at ourselves in training. And there's complicated things we can use. There's tools on our wrist that we can use that maybe aren't as accurate. So let's start off here with what can people do at home to monitor their physiology, and how can that be applied to their training? If we start from what would you say is the gold standard compared to what could you be doing yourself, which is pretty much free?
Yeah. Okay. I think the gold standard for measuring and really assessing your training zones has to be a lab test. That's probably where people think of exercise physiology. They think of in a lab with a mask on, doing collecting some cool data. And to be honest, that probably is the most accurate in terms of we're in a controlled environment and we can get all the measures we need. We can take lactate, we can take oxygen consumption measures, we can measure heart rate, etc. And what we'd do is we'd do a step test. So we'd run through a range of speeds from easy through to kind of, a relatively hard intensity, maybe 5K pace at the end. And we measured the lactate responses to each speed. Yeah. And you end up with this lactate curve. And from that, you can pick out those thresholds and plot the training zones. More and more so, though, we started translating that, or taking the lab out into the field, as I like to say. Because what we actually found is that, in a lab, whilst it is a controlled environment and it's really be really specific and collect lots of information, it's not the environment that athletes are competing in and running in and training in. So actually, when you got the athletes to run at the speeds that you get from a lab test, sometimes there's a little bit of a discrepancy.
Yeah, I've seen that
when they go on the track. So actually, we do a lot of testing now. We do exactly the same test, the step test. We do it out on the track. Now, obviously, there's you can't control things like the weather as much. Pacing is an issue, but Birmingham, we have the wave lights now, which kind of takes care of that. So for me, that I said the lab test is the gold standard. A physiology test, guess what I'm saying, whether it's in the lab or a field, is the best way to really detect those thresholds. Obviously, we've started doing that on the workshops, the physiology workshops that we offer. And that's a really good way of athletes, firstly, benchmarking where they're at. Where are my thresholds at? We know that they're important predictors of performance. And if they're moving in the right direction, pretty safe to say their performance is going to be improving over the endurance events. But what's really valuable about that is it allows us to give bespoke training zones. So we can give them pace targets. We can give them heart rate zones to go away and use. And
just on that note, because it's an interesting point, is we used to run those workshops under the Runners Retreats model, which obviously is our partner company, or company that we run and we deliver the coaching for. We do that in partnership with Run Through UK. But We have since now taken those workshops back to New Levels Coaching, because we are delivering those with our coaching team now on a regular basis. You know, we're talking 3 or 4 times a year now, due to the success and due to the demand of those workshops. They're brilliant because we have the Wave Light technology at Birmingham. We can help people with their pacing. We have a physiology team on hand. We go through that step test. You deliver an educational day as well as the testing, and off the back of that day, they're able to get a physiological profile. And if they want to, there's also options of add-ons of coach consultations and online coaching off the back of it. So if they even want help applying that to the training, we also offer that. It's all fitting into the New Levels Coaching model. We've got one. If people are listening here thinking, well, that sounds really cool and I didn't even know about that, we've got one as part of the Loughborough weekend in August this year, or August weekend, 10th, 11th, that sort of time. And then we've also got one September the 29th back at Birmingham. The one at Loughborough is slightly different. We don't have the Wave Light, but it's more of a structured full day at Loughborough. The Birmingham one is just a one-day thing. It's not part of the performance weekend. So a couple of opportunities there if people do want that information. They want to find out a little bit more. And we will be running those continually throughout the year, even into next year, because as you said, Dave, some people like to get that baseline, they get that marker, but then actually they like to come back and say, well, where am I now after 6 months of training?
Yeah, and it's been really nice. We've already got data on a few athletes that have done several tests, and it hopefully they move in the right direction. But it paints a nice picture, and it allows you to assess how have you responded to a training block. Obviously, the race results should speak for themselves, and that's what's most important. But really, what's going on under the bonnet to try and explain that. And if it does go backwards again, like let's not hide. Like it's useful to know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And reflect on, okay, well, I've gone backwards. Like, why have I gone backwards? Have I been doing the wrong kind of training? Have I been ill or injured? Which there's usually a good explanation behind it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really valuable from that sense.
And to apply that to coaching, which has been super valuable for me, and this is where the technology comes in. Like now with Final Surge, which we use as a training tool, it's where we set all our athletes training online. We can now put those zones into Final Surge, and those zones can then be applied to the training that the athlete's doing. So the athlete gets that pace guidance within those training zones. Now, you can go even more complicated. You can push the workout to their Garmin and it can tell them what pace to go. Like, I'm not that bothered about that type of thing, because I think we should always have pace ranges depending on conditions and how the athlete feels. But what I will say as a coaching team, when we have been looking at this and debriefing and evaluating as we go, we have seen massive success with people who've come to the physiology day, they've had that physiology applied to their coaching, and they've then seen those improvements. So I know I've shared that with you previously, but I want to say to you, like, it has been successful. We haven't had someone come along and go, oh my God, I've gone backwards, unless it's been somebody who's not been training. But people who we've worked with who've applied this, because I think back to our original point is where I'm going with this, is they now understand the purpose of it, and they're bought into those training zones, and they are training smarter. And we label those workshops train smarter to run faster. And that's what we do mean by it. But it's one thing understanding it, it's another thing then applying it. But you can apply it yourself with all the knowledge we give on the day.
Yeah, and you've literally just described most of my job there, Lewis, and as a physiologist, not as a coach. There is it's to use data to help inform athletes and coaches, and yeah, it's been great to see that come into fruition.
So once we've gone through that then, so people can go to a lab, they can have some field-based testing. What about things that they can do like day to day, or how do they know what training zones they're in?
It's a really good point, because another reason to get tested semi-regularly is that zones become outdated, because
fair point.
They can vary day to day because of fatigue, but they're pretty stable. But if you go away and put a real structured block of training, like your tempo zone 2-3 months later is, it shouldn't be the same. So we almost have to develop a level of intuition with knowing how each zone should feel. So back to the point, I referred to Tamer. He's so in tune, he knows what each zone feels like. So if he's getting fitter, he will just naturally be running a bit quicker to stay in that zone. And that's what I'd always encourage people is they get the report, they go away and they've got some guidance of these kind of heart rates, these kind of paces, and then you, rather than just running and not thinking, really try and cement what those zones feel like, so that as you get fitter, you can have the confidence to say, do you know what, I'm now running 20 seconds per mile quicker for my tempo zone. but I'm confident that I'm in the right zone. And I guess like the easiest tool for that, I've mentioned heart rate, which is great. That there is some issues with heart rate. We won't go too much into that, but I would say if you're going to use heart rate, make sure you're using a chest strap rather than the wrist-based monitors. Even the new armband monitors, they're better than the wrist from my experience, but they're still not perfect. So if you're going to measure it properly with a chest strap monitor. Would be the thing I say, and just be aware of the dynamics of heart rate, so that there's a lag in heart rate. When we start an interval, it'll take 2 or 3 minutes to reach a steady state, to get to where it needs to be. So, and the same thing happens during the recovery period. So just be aware of that. But probably the most important tool that we've all got available to us is just running to feel, or listening to our breathing specifically. We refer to, some of you guys might have heard about the talk test before, and there's good reason for that. It is linked to physiology, as I'll try and explain. But basically, again, if we take that 3-zone model, below the lactate threshold, you could have a full conversation.
So this is the easier recovery.
Yeah, easier recovery, and there's a bit of a transition. It's a wide zone. So as you're at the top end, maybe the conversation, maybe having the odd breath now and again, but you could, just as we're talking now, we could be running as well.
Breathing rates up, but there's no problem holding down a conversation.
No problem at all.
And that's the big easy zone 1. The 3 model, easy.
Yeah. So 1, or the 5-zone model would be 1 and 2.
Okay.
So that's zone 1. It's easy. Zone 2. So when you cross that first lactate threshold and you go into that moderate or medium zone, or steady as we might call it, that's when you'll notice there's just a slight elevation in the breathing. You start to not hyperventilate by any means, but you start to notice your breathing rate is increased, your ventilation's increased. And if we were having the conversation, hence the talk test, we'd still be able to chat, but we'd every kind of we'd speak in kind of a couple of sentences, like maybe a sentence at a time, and then we'd have to gasp for a bit of air.
You're forcing yourself into a break, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so you can talk to someone, but it's not, you're not super comfortable. You're having to take a few breathers. And the way I describe, not breathing here, but the way I describe how that feels is like, particularly on a bike, I noticed this. When you're in that easy zone, you could go all day, and you could. I like to listen to podcasts when I'm training. You can listen to a podcast and you can really think about that podcast and put some mental energy. As soon as you go across that threshold and you enter that middle zone, your breathing's elevated, and it just becomes a little bit more taxing. And if you're trying to do a task, sometimes I'll be replying to emails even when I'm training. I can't do the emails then. I can't think
on the bike. You
on
mean,
the bike. Yeah, not running. But like it just starts to get a little bit more taxing mentally as much as physically. And then when you go above the second lactate threshold and you go into that high intensity zone, you can maybe say a couple of words at a time, but you can't really have a conversation, and it obviously it feels hard. And there's a physiological reason for that, and that's what's driving us to breathe more, to elevate our breathing, is carbon dioxide production, and that follows lactate production. So it's basically a byproduct of lactate metabolism is we produce carbon dioxide, and that triggers us automatically to start breathing heavier. So you really can,
because we need to get rid of it.
We need to get rid of it. Yeah. The buildup of CO2, we need to get rid of that. So our body naturally, if it's working, will breathe harder. So you really can use something as simple as breathing to detect whether you're in zone 1, 2, or 3.
Yeah. Brilliant. And we saying that we nicked from one of the run through club nights, because Katie came to Morsey last year, of course, Katie Buckingham, and she said, we use it at the run through club nights. Our coaches use it as if you can't talk, then walk. And I thought it's a really nice way of just explaining, like, if you can't talk, you're going too hard, so unless it's the purpose of the session, of course. She was relating it in terms of the warm up and being in that low zone 1. If we go to the zone 3, the 3-zone model, zone 1, easy. If you can't talk, then you probably should be slowing down to a walk run at that point. Yeah. Really nicely described. And I'm not going to add anything to that, because I think it's perfect. And that talk test is very easy. You can apply it to an RPE scale as well, rate of perceived exertion. We've done a lot on that in the past. Done a podcast with Matt Long on that, in the past. So go back and listen to those episodes if you want a little bit more detail on running to feel, running to split, using that torque test, those RPE scales to help. But how I want to tie all this together, Dave, was initially at the start we spoke about time and getting people used to or familiar to running to time. And something you mentioned there, which again has been a huge learning for me as a coach, when I started to analyze data more recently, I've always known there was a bit of a lag in terms of the heart rate getting up there. But I started to look at it in a bit more detail. And I'm talking like the last few months with this. And I just, when you get a bit of an obsession in your head as a coach, you think, I'm just going to spend a bit of time analyzing this. And I was looking at that lag on certain sessions. And I was thinking, God, I'm setting sessions here and they're not getting up to where I want them to be for like 25% of that session. So I was like, they're actually doing only 75% of the work of what I'm trying to set them. So for example, let's say if I'm trying to get 45 minutes worth of tempo out of them and I'm doing that in reps. And I was looking at it going, well, actually, they're only running at about, for about 37, 38 minutes of that 45 where I want them to be. There's a lag on every time I stop them and restart them, which is where, firstly, the benefit of the continuous tempo comes in if people do it right, because they stay in that kind of steady zone, particularly with the heart rate. But also it made me recognize, okay, well, I either need to extend the reps or extend the duration of the session in order to get the amount I want out of it. It was a real big learning for me. But also it then got me thinking about, okay, I'm not going to get too bogged down with setting things to distance, whether that's miles or kilometers, whatever it is that they prefer, the athlete. I'm actually going to set a lot to time, because then I can be very prescriptive. Back to your point earlier, I know the purpose behind why I'm prescribing it and I know what I want from it. And I can do that from a time capacity, because somebody who, again, we'll use the analogy of the marathon runners just because we've used that throughout. So we'll go with Safan Hassan, who's running 2:13 for the marathon. Her kilometer splits for a session of 8 by 1 kilometer is going to be very different to somebody who's running 4 hours for a marathon. If you give them the same session, if you say we're going to do 8 times 1K off 90 seconds recovery, Safan Hassan might do those in 3 minutes per kilometer, as an example. But somebody who's running 4 hours a marathon might be doing those in 5 minutes per kilometer. The session itself is so different. Safan Hassan is getting 90 seconds for every 3 minutes. That's only 50% recovery time. The person who's running for 5 minutes is getting a whole lot less recovery time comparatively to the time they're running. And the duration of session is so much different.
Yeah, so I mean, springs to mind. You used to set me 6 by a mile, and I think most competitive endurance runner will have done that at some point in their kind of winter base phase, and that's about 30 minutes of work for us back in the day. 6 by a mile off a minute recovery. For some people, that's over an hour of running.
Yes.
A minute recovery off, if you're running more than 10 minutes per mile, is not a lot. So yeah, you're dead right. And I base most of my things on time, or if I don't, it's because I've kind of done the maths in my head, and you know what it equates 3 by a mile, I'm thinking that's 3 by 10 minutes for a certain athlete.
Yeah, you've done the maths in relation to the athlete you're working with, is what you're saying there. Exactly. Yeah, and this is what annoys me about certain plans that are written, which is why when we're devising plans now, and certainly if somebody comes to us and says, I just want a plan devising, and we do it to time, and they look at it and say, why have you done it to time? And we explain it to them. Because the big thing here is I seen something on social media the other day and it just rattled me. It kind of really got to me. It was a classic mile session. And they said, right, the best session for a half marathon runner is this many mile reps or this recovery. And I'm thinking, hang on a second, any half marathon runner is going to look at this and take that session and think, I've got to be able to do that session. Then they said, and you should be able to do these mile reps between 10K pace and half marathon pace. And I'm thinking, again, that's a tough session for certain people. Then they said, okay, and then you've got 1 minute recovery and then you're going to go again. And this session should take you around about this time. And I'm thinking, this is mental that they're saying this to the general population, assuming that everybody falls into the same bracket. And I just thought about that and thought that is such bad advice going out to people, because that session, we're using the 6 by a mile here, is so different from one runner to the other runner. And it does come back to this element of time, isn't it?
It does, yeah. And I guess just flipping back to your previous point there around looking at data and timing zones is often, something as a physiologist I'll look at with athletes, and that's where, the intricacies of session design is really interesting and really important, because you could do 30 minutes of running at a given intensity, and depending on how you slice and dice it, can have a very different physiological response. One session, it might be most of that 30 minutes you're in your desired heart rate zone, whereas another way it might be very little of it. But I guess the only pushback to that and challenge, I guess, is, again, we're often in things like training zones, we're very guilty of oversimplifying things, and things like the VO2 max training zone, which you'll see.
Yeah.
People look at that and assume that, okay, if I want to improve my VO2 max, I've got to spend time in the VO2 max zone, which is not to say that won't drive some of those adaptations, but they forget that needs to be combined with a lot of easy running that's well away from VO2 max. Because it's trying to, without going in too much depth, you're then working out, okay, well, what physiologically determines someone's VO2 max? And coming back to the time in zones analogy, time in heart rate zones, if you're trying to work on central adaptations, i.e. making the heart bigger and more efficient, improving our cardiac output, how much blood our heart can pump, then you probably want to look at time in certain zones. But if you might not spend a lot of time in a heart rate zone, but you're exposing yourself to 30 minutes of running at a given intensity, you're still exposing the muscle to that intensity. So for a lot of more what we call peripheral adaptations away from the heart, just because you're not spending time in a heart rate zone doesn't mean you're not getting a stimulus and a response from that session. And often, particularly with well-trained athletes, that the heart is probably near its capacity to improve.
Yeah.
We reach a plateau in VO2 max. We see that quite a lot in athletes. Then what we see is, okay, we've maybe reached or got close to our ceiling of our VO2 max. We now want to bring up everything underneath that, and we want to be able to run as close to our VO2 max as possible for the given distance. And that's where the lactate threshold is super important. And what determines the lactate threshold? It's not specifically the heart. It's more at a muscular peripheral level. So I think it's I agree with that, and I think again, I've had conversations with the coaches at Birmingham where we've actually challenged the thought sometimes around: do you need to spend time in heart rate zone for something like a tempo run, or is it just breaking the session up to make it as, relatively speaking, easy as possible, but still get 30 minutes of exposure to that intensity.
Same benefit. Yeah, and that comes back to the point, which hasn't been a learning of mine, which I've always kind of understood, this multifactorial approach to training where, and I think this is one key message I want to get across to people, is you don't just get one response, one adaptation from one session. If you see a threshold session in your schedule, don't just assume that you're just getting a threshold benefit. There's so much going on there, like physically, physiologically, mentally. Again, it comes back to that whole thing we spoke about at the start. Like, think about all those people who go into a team over at Birmingham. From the sessions that you do, you're probably getting benefits within each of those teams somewhere within one session.
Yeah, I think it's keep zooming out and keeping it simple. And whilst we can be a bit more strategic and specific with how we distribute our training, ultimately the most important thing, if we come back to just basic training principles, is progressive overload, consistency, variation of training, and maybe particularly as we get close to events, some specificity. And you're dead right. Like, again, my point around, we oversimplify things, that just because something's called threshold, people assume that that's the only way to improve your threshold. If you imagine the curve, if you improve the bottom end of the curve, improve your base, it's going to push the whole curve up. So you can improve your threshold, and we see this a lot, particularly with athletes starting out without even running anywhere near your threshold. There's probably is some benefits to training at that threshold in terms of, efficiency of clearing lactate.
Absolutely.
Making the plug bigger, to come back to your analogy. But I think we often fall into that trap, even as coaches and not just athletes, of VO2 max zone, that means that's where we improve our VO2 max, and it's unfortunately not as simple as that.
No, and I think that's a really good point to kind of end on, is that, and that could be a discussion for another podcast down the line, is that we look at it, and even as coaches, as you say, we get wrapped up in that world of thinking, right, what does the athlete need to work on? What is their kind of weakness at the minute? Right, we need to improve that. But flip that on its head. You might have an athlete who you feel like is kind of maxed out on that, like they're really good in that area. So you actually look at other areas that you can improve, which is also going to push that area further. So you've almost like maxed out on that area, but then that's the importance of not neglecting other areas to see how they all link together. And I think physiology as a whole, and looking at the energy systems, like my basic understanding of it is, and mine is a lot more basic than yours, but I do have that understanding is like they're always working together when we are exercising. So like once you start exercising, don't just assume that you're just getting that one benefit or you're in one zone. Like everything is working collectively together. So there's always these adaptations going on. And yes, we can get clever with it, but ultimately I always go back to what's like black and white. And a great coach to me said, like, when you're training, you're getting fitter. Like and then some points we've got to get clever with it, as we've said today, and it becomes a bit more strategic, progressive overload. And we don't want you to just go out and just think, if I just go out and run the same pace every day, then I'm going to get fitter. That's not what we're saying here. But there is an element of, you can overcomplicate things as well. So you don't want it too simple, but you don't want it too complicated. There's got to be a bit of a middle ground in there.
Yeah, 100%. I think you picked up on that point there of, reversibility. Unfortunately, training adaptations, we lose them way quicker than we gain them. We can work for months at something and lose it in a couple of weeks or even less. So the most important thing is avoiding. It's not to say never have a week or two off. At the end of a hard season or a marathon, you need to reset, and that might mean getting less fit temporarily. But the most important thing when we're trying to build fitness and towards a goal is training consistency. And if that means doing a little bit less or being a little bit lower on the intensity to protect ourselves from injury or illness, then that's the most important thing. And it's much. It takes, the analogy I would use is like, it takes a lot less to maintain something than it does to gain it. So once we've reached a level of fitness and we're flying, that's the most dangerous part as an athlete.
Absolutely, yeah.
Whenever you've got athletes flying, it's where I get most nervous. And actually, there's a tendency there for the athlete and even the coach sometimes to want to keep pushing. Oh, let's get to that next level.
Yeah.
But actually, that's probably the time to pull things back, knowing that we're at that level. It's going to take a lot less work to maintain that fitness level.
Couldn't agree more with that. Couldn't agree more. And I think one area we've not touched on today is like the importance of rest and recovery, but we've touched on that a lot in the podcast in the past, but it is a big part of this discussion. So I don't want to just neglect it and say, oh, we've not discussed rest and recovery. But if you're listening to this and you've really enjoyed it and you think, oh, they've not spoken about rest and recovery, go back to some of the other podcasts. I talk about it a lot with Paula Radcliffe in the Paula Radcliffe episode, and she talks about the importance of, she, in her words, I'd rather get to the start line being 100% healthy and 90% fit than the opposite way around. Because she said if you're 100% fit but only 90% healthy, in her experiences, that was a bad thing. And I think it's a great way to describe it. I've talked about a lot on the podcast with Dr. Rich Blagrove as well, another doctor we've had on. So you've got to get a promotion, Dave, to become in the doctor category. Rich Blagrove talked a lot about strength and conditioning, a lot about those adaptations and the importance of rest and recovery. So there's a couple of good podcasts to go back there and listen to specifically about rest and recovery. But I didn't just want to neglect that and say, we're just telling you to train. Absolutely not. Dave's touching it nicely there to say, look, you need to also get the adaptations and you don't want to be overdoing this type of stuff as well. Brill. I enjoyed that, mate.
That was good. I don't know how long we've been.
I think it might be a record.
Yeah. I have a feeling that was longer than planned, but thanks for having me on. It was really good to chat all things physiology and training.
Well, I think that is an NLC podcast record. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think we've gone over the hour, but it was a fascinating conversation and I could have been here for a whole lot longer. And I think what that means is we will get Dave back on for a part 2 in the near future, but we will give him some time off in between. As always, we'll continue to educate you on our social media platforms around this type of stuff as well. But if you are interested in coming to any of the physiology days, check out the New Levels Coaching website or the Runner Retreat website. You can come on to those days. You can book on. We do have a maximum capacity because we've got to limit that, unfortunately, to make sure that we don't, we have the right amount of people there to work with the physiologists on the ground. But yes, you're more than welcome there. And it's for athletes of all abilities. It's not just for elite athletes. It's people who want that bit more of an insight into the world of physiology. So check that out. In the meantime, as always, enjoy your training. Good luck with any races that you have coming up. And we will see you all again very, very soon. Thanks for joining us again. See you all soon.